In this episode, we move away from the idea that risk is a vague feeling and instead treat it as a practical way to make decisions when you cannot do everything at once. Security risk is not a scoreboard for how scary something sounds, and it is not a prediction that a bad thing will definitely happen. Risk is a structured way to talk about uncertainty, harm, and priority in language that leaders and teams can actually use. When you evaluate risk well, you can explain why one problem deserves attention before another, even if both problems sound serious. You can also explain why a control is worth the effort, not because it is fashionable, but because it changes the odds or reduces the damage in a measurable way. For brand new learners, the big shift is learning to connect technical issues to business outcomes, because businesses do not buy security for the sake of security. They buy it to protect operations, money, trust, and the ability to keep delivering what they promise. A simple way to begin is to define risk as a relationship between something that could happen and the harm that would follow if it did. In security, that something could be a ransomware incident, an account takeover, a data leak, or a long outage caused by an attack. The harm could be financial loss, legal trouble, disrupted operations, reputational damage, or safety impacts depending on the environment. Evaluating risk is not only naming the threat, but estimating how likely it is and how bad it would be. That is where likelihood, impact, and exposure come in, because they force you to talk about risk in parts that can be reasoned about. Likelihood is how probable the event is within a defined time window. Impact is the severity of harm if the event occurs, and exposure is the amount of value that is actually at stake given how the business works. You can think of exposure as how much of the business is reachable by the problem, how long it stays vulnerable, and how widely it could affect critical assets. When you use these parts consistently, risk stops being a debate about feelings and becomes a debate about assumptions. Likelihood is often the most confusing part for beginners because it sounds like a math problem, but in practice it is an informed estimate, not a perfect calculation. Likelihood asks whether the conditions exist for an event to occur and whether there are realistic pathways for an attacker or accident to trigger it. For example, if a service is exposed to the internet, runs an outdated version, and has weak access controls, the likelihood of an exploit attempt and possible compromise is higher than if the same service is isolated and tightly controlled. Likelihood is shaped by threat activity in the world, but it is also shaped by the specific environment, because an attack that is common in one industry might be rare in another. Beginners sometimes confuse likelihood with frequency, assuming that if something happened once, it will happen again soon, or if it has never happened, it must be unlikely. A better approach is to look at the ingredients of the event: exposure pathways, attacker incentives, control strength, and detection capability. If the ingredients are present and the path is easy, the likelihood is not something you can wish away by saying it has not happened yet. The point is to be honest about conditions, not to guess perfectly. Impact is the part that translates security into business language, because impact is what leaders actually care about when they decide what to fund and what to accept. Impact includes direct costs like response labor, legal support, customer notification, and restoration work, but it also includes indirect costs like downtime, missed revenue, lost productivity, and damage to trust. Impact also includes the cost of decision constraints, such as having to pause operations, rebuild systems, or change processes quickly under pressure. For beginners, it helps to expand impact beyond money, because some impacts are strategic and take longer to show up, like churn, partner distrust, or regulatory scrutiny that increases future costs. Impact is also shaped by how prepared the organization is, because an organization with solid backups, rehearsed response processes, and clear communication may experience less severe consequences than one that improvises. Beginners sometimes treat impact as a single number, but impact is often multidimensional, and that is why conversations can get messy. Your job in evaluating impact is to define what kinds of harm matter most to this business and to estimate how severe they would be if a specific event occurs. When you do that, you give leaders a way to compare security investments to other investments using a shared set of priorities. Exposure is the piece that connects likelihood and impact to the real shape of the environment, and it is often what makes risk discussions finally click. Exposure is not just whether a vulnerability exists, but how broadly it could be used and how much value it could touch. A vulnerability on a low-value test system that cannot reach anything important creates a different exposure profile than the same vulnerability on an identity system that touches every user and every application. Exposure also includes how long the weakness remains present, because a short-lived exposure window may be less risky than a persistent exposure that lasts for months. For beginners, a useful way to think about exposure is to ask what the attacker can reach, what they can affect, and what they can take once they get in. If compromise of one endpoint gives access to a shared file system used by the entire company, the exposure is high because the blast radius is large. If compromise of one endpoint is contained by segmentation and least privilege, the exposure is lower because the blast radius is smaller even if compromise still occurs. Exposure is therefore where architecture and control placement show up in risk language, because good design reduces how far harm can spread. When you include exposure explicitly, you avoid shallow arguments that treat all vulnerabilities as equally dangerous just because they have the same technical label. When you combine likelihood, impact, and exposure, you can express risk in a way that is clear enough to drive prioritization without pretending you have perfect precision. Many organizations use qualitative categories, such as low, medium, and high, because those categories can be applied consistently even when data is incomplete. The danger is that categories become vague if people do not define what they mean, which leads to endless debates where everyone uses the same words differently. A better approach is to attach rationale to each category, explaining what factors made likelihood high or low, what impact dimensions mattered, and what exposure assumptions were used. For beginners, the goal is not to become a statistician, but to become disciplined in reasoning. That discipline includes stating the time window, such as risk over the next quarter or risk over the next year, because likelihood changes with time. It also includes stating what type of impact you are evaluating, such as impact to revenue, operations, or compliance, because impact changes with context. When you do this, you make risk discussions more honest and less political. You also make it easier to revisit decisions later and understand why the organization chose a certain path. A key skill in business-oriented risk evaluation is separating the existence of a weakness from the likelihood of it being exploited in this environment. A vulnerability might have a severe technical rating, but if it exists on a system with no inbound access, strong segmentation, and tight monitoring, the likelihood of real exploitation may be lower than the same vulnerability on an exposed system. Conversely, a vulnerability that looks modest in a generic rating system might be highly likely to be abused if it is on a critical system that is widely accessible and poorly monitored. Beginners often lean too heavily on external scores because scores feel objective, but scores are only part of the story. Likelihood should incorporate the attacker's practical pathway, including whether the system is reachable, whether authentication is required, and whether exploitation requires a rare skill or a common trick. It should also incorporate how easy it is for defenders to detect and respond, because a quickly detected and contained event may still be serious but can reduce downstream harm. The point is to avoid a naive approach where you rank risks by the loudest number on a report. Instead, you translate technical findings into environmental reality by asking how, here, now, this could actually happen. Impact evaluation also becomes more useful when you tie it to concrete business functions rather than abstract labels like critical or severe. A manager understands impact more clearly when you explain which workflows would stop, which customers would be affected, and which obligations would be missed. For example, the impact of losing access to a billing system is different from the impact of losing a development test environment, even if both are inconvenient. Impact is also influenced by timing, because an outage during a peak season can be far more damaging than an outage during a slow period. Beginners sometimes overlook timing, but businesses feel timing deeply, and risk language should reflect that. Another important aspect is recovery cost, because the impact of an event includes what it takes to restore trust, rebuild systems, and verify that the environment is safe again. If recovery is slow, labor-intensive, or requires external support, impact increases even if the initial incident looks contained. When you evaluate impact in this richer way, your risk discussion stops sounding like a technical report and starts sounding like operational planning. That is exactly what leaders need in order to make sensible trade-offs. Exposure is also where you can explain why some risks deserve immediate action even if the likelihood is not certain, because high exposure can make uncertainty unacceptable. A common example is an identity system that, if compromised, can be used to access everything else because the exposure is effectively enterprise-wide. Another example is a shared storage location that contains sensitive customer data because the exposure includes legal and trust consequences that are hard to unwind. Exposure can also be amplified by interdependencies, such as when many applications rely on a single service, creating a single point of failure. Beginners often underestimate exposure because they look at the vulnerable component alone, not at what depends on it and what it can reach. A helpful approach is to ask what privileges the component has, what network paths it can access, and what data it can read or modify. You also ask what would happen if that component were unavailable, because outages are a form of exposure too. By making these connections explicit, you help leaders see that risk is not only the chance of compromise, but also the scope of consequence. Exposure is therefore a bridge between technical architecture and business impact, and it is often the bridge that makes a risk argument persuasive. Another essential part of evaluating risk in business terms is acknowledging control strength, because risk is never evaluated in a vacuum. Controls reduce likelihood by blocking or discouraging attacks. They reduce impact by limiting damage and speeding recovery, and they reduce exposure by shrinking blast radius. This is where you talk about existing defenses honestly, not optimistically, because wishful thinking is one of the biggest sources of surprise during incidents. For beginners, it helps to differentiate between a control existing and a control being effective, because a control that is misconfigured or rarely monitored might provide little real reduction. Strong controls are usually measurable in some way, such as coverage, tuning quality, response speed, or compliance rates, while weak controls often exist only as assumptions. When you evaluate likelihood, you can say likelihood is lower because authentication is strong and monitored, or likelihood is higher because remote access is common and detection is inconsistent. When you evaluate impact, you can say impact is lower because backups are reliable and tested, or impact is higher because recovery would require rebuilding many systems manually. When you evaluate exposure, you can say exposure is lower because segmentation limits access, or exposure is higher because flat networks allow wide movement. Controls are the levers you can pull, and risk evaluation is how you decide which levers matter most. Beginners also benefit from understanding residual risk, which is the risk that remains after you apply reasonable controls. Residual risk is not a confession of failure, because no organization can remove all risk without stopping business activity. The point of security is not to eliminate every bad possibility, but to reduce risk to a level the organization can accept while still operating. Residual risk is where business leadership must often be involved, because accepting risk is a business decision, not a purely technical one. Your job as a security leader is to describe the residual risk clearly, including what could still happen and what the consequences could be, and to explain what additional reductions are possible if the organization invests more. For beginners, this is a big mindset shift because it replaces the simplistic idea of secure versus insecure with a spectrum of better and worse. It also prevents false promises, because saying a system is secure can create dangerous complacency. When you speak in terms of residual risk, you are honest that security is about managing uncertainty, not achieving a magical perfect state. That honesty builds credibility and supports better decision-making over time. Evaluating risk in business terms also means being careful with how you communicate uncertainty, because uncertainty is unavoidable, but it should not paralyze action. You can be uncertain about exact likelihood and still be confident that a risk is high priority due to exposure and potential impact. You can also be uncertain about impact and still be confident that a risk is worth addressing because it affects a mission-critical workflow. Beginners sometimes think uncertainty means you cannot decide, but in risk work, uncertainty is a normal input that you account for. One way to do that is to use ranges and scenarios in your reasoning without turning the conversation into speculation. Another way is to use confidence language, stating whether you have high confidence in your assessment or whether you need more data to refine it. You can also focus on decisions that are low regret, meaning actions that are beneficial even if your estimates are off, such as improving monitoring, reducing unnecessary exposure, or tightening least privilege. The key is to keep the conversation grounded in what is known while acknowledging what is not. When you do that, you help leaders make decisions that are prudent without demanding perfect information. A practical risk evaluation also accounts for threat motivation and opportunity, because attackers do not choose targets randomly. Some organizations hold data that is highly valuable, some operate services that must stay online, and some have public profiles that make them attractive targets. Opportunity includes how reachable systems are, how predictable defenses are, and whether common weaknesses exist. Beginners sometimes treat attackers as a single force, but different attackers pursue different goals, and that changes which risks are more likely. For example, opportunistic attackers might target broadly exposed services with known weaknesses, while more patient attackers might target identity systems and long-term access. Mapping this to likelihood helps you avoid treating every technical finding as equally attractive to an attacker. It also helps you explain why certain controls, like hardening exposed services or protecting identity, have outsized value. You do not need to name specific threat groups to do this well, because the evaluation is about incentives and feasibility. If the reward for an attacker is high and the effort is low, likelihood is higher, especially when exposure is broad. This reasoning turns threat talk into business-relevant prioritization rather than fear-based storytelling. Risk evaluation becomes especially meaningful when it drives a clear priority decision, such as whether to remediate now, mitigate temporarily, accept risk, or redesign to reduce exposure. Even though those choices can be discussed in many ways, the core idea is that risk evaluation should lead to an action path rather than ending as a report. A high likelihood, high impact, high exposure risk usually demands urgent action because delay allows the window of harm to remain open. A low likelihood but extreme impact risk might justify architectural investment to reduce exposure, even if the chance is uncertain, because the outcome would be catastrophic. A moderate risk issue might be scheduled into planned work with clear timelines and monitoring in the meantime. Beginners sometimes assume that security always demands immediate fixing, but businesses must balance many priorities, so risk language must support realistic sequencing. The key is to make the trade-offs explicit, so if a risk is deferred, everyone understands what is being accepted and why. When risk evaluation is used this way, it becomes a tool for alignment, turning security decisions into shared choices rather than one team's demands. As you get more comfortable with this approach, you start to notice that the best risk evaluations are the ones that can be explained simply without losing rigor. You can say the likelihood is high because the system is exposed and controls are weak. The impact is high because the system supports revenue and contains sensitive data, and the exposure is high because compromise could spread through shared access. That kind of explanation is short, but it is not shallow because it rests on clear assumptions that can be challenged and improved. Beginners often fear that business language will water down technical reality, but good business language actually sharpens reality by forcing you to connect issues to outcomes. It also improves accountability, because when you define risk in terms of likelihood, impact, and exposure, you can later measure whether controls change those factors. If you reduce exposure through segmentation, you should be able to explain how the blast radius shrank. If you reduce likelihood through stronger authentication and monitoring, you should be able to show fewer successful compromises or earlier detection. If you reduce impact through rehearsed recovery, you should be able to show faster restoration and less downtime. This is what makes risk evaluation a living practice rather than a one-time rating. Bringing everything together, evaluating risk in business terms means translating security uncertainty into decision clarity using likelihood, impact, and exposure as your anchors. Likelihood asks how plausible an event is given exposure pathways, attacker opportunity, and control strength, and it becomes more accurate when you describe assumptions openly. Impact asks what harm would occur in financial, operational, legal, and trust terms, and it becomes more useful when tied to real workflows and timing. Exposure asks how much of the organization and its critical assets are within reach if the event occurs, and it becomes more precise when you consider blast radius, dependencies, and duration. These three factors interact, which is why a high-exposure environment can turn moderate likelihood into urgent priority, and why strong recovery capability can reduce impact even when likelihood cannot be driven to zero. The outcome of this evaluation is not a perfect number, but a defensible priority and a clear action plan, supported by evidence rather than emotion. For a brand new learner, the most important lesson is that security earns its seat at the decision table when it speaks in terms leaders can act on, and likelihood, impact, and exposure give you the structure to do exactly that.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.